Hey folks, welcome back to Sedgwick Jimmy channel. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. I know we've pretty much focused on history up to this point, but today we are actually going to deal with folklore and cryptids. Basically, I greatly enjoy folklore, I greatly enjoy cryptids, and apparently I also enjoy ampersands. So yeah, that's where we are. Cryptids are just animals that the scientific community has not come to a consensus agreement on whether or not they exist. Some to the extent that there's nothing more than just eyewitness accounts and not really anything that's really documented. So a lot of people think of things like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, Ogopogo, Igopogo. Yeah, that's a weird one. But that's basically the idea of what a cryptid is. And of course, folklore is folklore. So let's get this puppy started. And today we are actually going to begin with Mokele Mbimbi. By the way, I'm just going to warn you ahead of time, I may really butcher some names in this recording. I apologize for that, but I'm doing my best. Mokele Mbimbe, I've actually always been interested in. I first found out about this one off a VHS tape called Dinosaurs when I was a kid. Mokele Mbimbe is actually found in the Congo River Basin. The name means one who stops the flow of rivers. It has actually been described as half elephant and half dragon. A lot of people believed that it is actually a dinosaur, a plesiosaur, that can be found in a river in Africa. I know that sounds kind of weird. As far as the first actual written documentation where it was reported in print, that goes back to 1909, though the actual stories go back much farther, back hundreds if not thousands of years. And when it was actually first reported back in 1909, there was a big stir. It actually created a big media uproar in the United States and the United Kingdom, because dinosaurs were very big back in the early 20th century, and the idea that, hey, possibly there's one that actually still exists is a big thing. Nowadays, a lot of the expeditions going down to the river basin in order to find Mokele and Bembe are actually done by what are known as young earthers. They're people that believe that evolution isn't true, and they actually try to somehow prove that evolution is false by finding a dinosaur in the Congo. Don't really know how that one works, but hey, if it floats your boat, float your boat. And by the way, a lot of people actually think that the rhinos or rhinoceroses or rhinoceri or however you want to say it are actually what people are seeing, as rhinos aren't native to the area, though they were at one time long ago, as in thousands of years ago, and that perhaps these are just stories that have been passed down from that. Interesting side note also, back in 2018 there was a expedition down to Lake Tele, again, forgive me if I mispronounce things, where they actually attempted to find evidence of Mokele and Bembe, and they failed to do so, but they did discover a new an entirely new species of green algae, so we got that out of it. By the way, just as kind of a little interesting side note, down in Burundi, not too terribly far away from the area we're talking about, is an actual creature. It's not a cryptid, it's an actual creature. It is a Nile crocodile of at least 20 feet, named Gustav. He supposedly has killed over 300 people. We know he is real because he is caught on camera. There have been PBS in a documentary to actually attempt to capture him. Yeah, that failed horribly. Locals actually believe that Gustav is bulletproof because local soldiers have opened fire on him and it did nothing. Now, a good part of that is probably because they were soldiers opening fire with automatic weapons at a crocodile, and they were scared crapless at the time, so that probably didn't help their aim. But yeah, just a little interesting side note. We don't know if there's a dinosaur down there, but we do know there's a great big crocodile that loves to kill people. So yeah, keep that in mind next time you head down that direction. The second we're actually going to look at today is kind of a mixture of folklore and cryptids, and that's actually going to be the Windigo or Vindigo or however you choose to pronounce it. Believe it or not, there are a ridiculous number of ways to pronounce and spell the name, so we're just going with Windigo. That's just the easiest one to go with. interesting thing about the Wendigo is it is a very far known legend inside the Algonquin speaking communities. The Algonquin speaking communities being a very wide range of different tribes. And since it is including a wide range of tribes, there's actually not just a lot of different ways in order to say the name or spell the name, but also different variations on the actual legend. Some believe that it is actually a spirit that has possessed a human. Now, one thing that they all typically have in common is that the Wendigo is a manifestation of greed or cannibalism. It's normally going to be associated with the winter. It's dark, cold, famine typically sets in. There's a lot of starvation, and typically when you're faced with these hardships, that's when you tend to turn to cannibalism. Again, cannibalism is a big thing when it comes to the Wendigo. As far as the different versions of it, one, like I said, is actually just a spirit that inhabits a human. The other is simply a human that goes insane. This is actually a real diagnosis known as Windigo psychosis. It's not really found much anymore. It pretty much died out in the early 20th century as the Algonquin tribes, became more interlinked with the Western ideals. So that kind of went the long way. Cool, a little interesting fact. Back in 1907, a Cree chief was actually arrested by the Canadian authorities. He was known as a great Wendigo fighter, and he actually had killed multiple people that suffered from Wendigo psychosis. And because of this, he was put on trial for murder. He actually ended up killing himself while in jail rather than face trial, which is, kind of understandable, I guess. But that's interesting little fact on that one. But also, the more interesting concept of the Wendigo is that it is the form of a very emaciated, extremely thin creature that's tall, very, very tall, but extremely thin, and no matter how much it eats, it grows according to what it eats, so that no matter how much it ingests, no matter how much it takes in, it will always be ravenously hungry. By the way, if you're actually interested in the idea of Wendigo psychosis, things like that, there's a movie from the 90s called Ravenous you might want to check out. It's actually pretty interesting. But yeah, the Wendigo, like I said, is a very well-known legendary creature from the north. Some believe it to actually exist. Most people actually just see it as more of a folklore figure. Either way, it's pretty interesting. And the next one we're going to talk about here is a little bit less known than some of the others. It's actually the Kaishi. The Kaishi is known from Angola. It is really an interesting legend. It supposedly is a very handsome, very good-looking young man to the front with long hair, but behind that hair is actually the head of a jackal. The whole idea is that this handsome man is actually very charming. He's pretty much kind of the ideal man that a woman would go after, hence it's just nothing more than a facade in order to fool her in, lower her guard so that the jackal can eat her. Actually, a really cool little story that comes from the folklore of the Kaishi concerns three girls that actually went out to collect water. And while they were out, they decided to kind of explore outside the village, and they came across a home. Inside that home, they found several good-looking men that were actually very nice, very charming. The younger sister really didn't trust the men that they met there, and so when they actually offered them food, the two older sisters ate. The youngest girl said, no, I think I'm okay on that. Eventually they show them, hey, you can sleep in this room. The girls go in the room in order to sleep, but the youngest sister just doesn't think something. She thinks, something's up, something's not quite right. And so she wakes her other sisters and says, hey, we gotta get out of here, something's not right, let's go. So they actually escape out of a window. Now, luckily, as they are running away, they happen to turn back and notice that the house is now on fire. The Kaishi had actually set the house on fire in order to burned them alive inside, and they were actually rather unhappy when they sifted through the ashes and didn't find any humans. Of course, so they set out after the girls. Eventually, they chased them down. The three sisters actually climbed up a tree, at which point the youngest was able to see an eagle. I know, it's a story, folks. And she offered the eagle chickens in order to carry her and her sisters away. The eagle, of course, agreed to this because that's what eagles do, and he carried her to safety. Now, the issue is that the second sister was actually too heavy, and he dropped her, and of course, she was devoured. And the third sister, unfortunately, the tree that they had climbed gave out before the eagle had time to return, and she also died. So I guess the whole point of the story is, if a handsome man invites you for food, you might want to be kind of careful whether or not you eat it, because you maybe end up being the one that gets eaten, and probably by a jackal. And continuing our little cavalcade of interesting things that I like to talk about here, we're actually going to go with the ideal of the Headless Horseman. Believe it or not, I know a lot of people probably think of the Headless Horseman from Washington Irving, his 1819 short story about the legend of Sleepy Hollow, but the Headless Horseman actually is found all over the world. Of course, it's one of the first pieces of folklore for the United States. It's possibly our first ghost story. But it actually has origins in other countries. The Irish have their own version of it, known as a Dullahan, which is actually a fairy that rides a black horse and carries their head under the arm. It's typically male, but from time to time there have been stories of female versions of it. Cool little side idea on the Dullahan is it actually uses a human spine for a whip. So, that's always fun. The Scottish actually have a version that was a man named Ewan who lost his head in battle and actually is just simply traveling around trying to find his head. The Brothers Grimm from the, German folklore, of course, actually had two different stories that pertain to headless humans, or headless horsemen, if you will. And actually, and I'm going to butcher this one again, the Jinjar of India are again headless horseman figures that go back hundreds of years. Now, the interesting thing about the Indian version is that they are seen as more heroic figures. Typically, they were born of violent or wrongful deaths while protecting innocent people. So it's a little bit different than most of the other ideas behind the headless horseman. Of course, like I said from before, the one that most people read, or most people listening to this, listening to this, are going to think of course, is Washington Irving's version. Now, you also may think of Tim Burton's version, which is Washington Irving's version. Wow, that's a tongue twister. But yeah, it's basically the same thing. So yeah, Headless Horsemen, like I said, are actually very well known across the world. There are actually some legends in Texas, particularly when it came to headless cowboys. Personally, when I think of anything or anyone headless, I always think of Anne Boleyn with the old song with her head tucked underneath her arm. Some people are familiar with that one. But yeah, the really interesting concept behind the Headless Horseman, in that it is possibly the first ghost story of the United States. It's possibly the first piece of folklore that the United States ever bore. It predates Johnny Appleseed. It predates Pecos Bill. It predates Paul Bunyan. So it's actually really important when it came to the creation of a new culture in our country, to create our own types of folklore, and it really got a head start jumping and kicking with that Headless Horseman. Atmospheric beasts are an idea that I actually find really interesting. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about them here, but just the concept of creatures that are lighter than air that can actually exist within the atmosphere. To me, the idea that there are unknown creatures in the ocean is terrifying. You add to that just the vast expanse of the atmosphere and what could possibly be up there. Again, the concept is terrifying. Honestly, I would not want to be on an airplane and run into a enormous jellyfish like creature that's floating its way through the atmosphere. So yeah, again, it's something that kind of terrifies me personally, but I just like to share my dread, kind of like Batman. And last but certainly not least is the good old fashioned story of Spring Heeled Jack. Some of you may be familiar with Spring Heeled Jack. I've always really been interested with just the concept of Spring-Heeled Jack, just this idea of a man dressed in sealskin with a helmet that can jump over 9-foot walls while, laughing maniacally in a high pitch. Just really seemed kind of interesting. For obvious reasons. Spring-Heeled Jack actually was first spotted in London in 1837, and there were reports of sightings of him all over Britain, from England to Scotland, to Wales, pretty much all over the United Kingdom. They had sightings of old Spring-Heeled Jack. Again, supposedly he wore a sealskin suit, he wore a cape, some sort of helmet, and supposedly he had clawed hands and eyes that burned like red balls of fire. So he sounds like the kind of guy you'd love to meet in a nice Victorian era alleyway. Basically, he's kind of a folklore version of Jack the Ripper, before Jack the Ripper. Now, the cool thing about Spring-Heeled Jack is that he actually has spawned a different version. Back in World War II in Prague, there was actually a version of Spring-Heeled Jack that was known as Parak. Again, probably butchered that, but hey, what can I do? Now, he actually has become a folklore hero. There have been comic books that actually star this character that have been made over in Czechoslovakia at the time. He's really well known as just a folk hero. Which is kind of odd considering the origin of that, being the original Spring-Heeled Jack, who was seen more as a devil or a demon that actually terrorized people, rather than a heroic figure that actually helped fight the Nazis. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting how some of these stories can transfer themselves to different places in order to help in times of trouble, and in times of heartache. So it's always good to have things like that, and it's always interesting to see how these things can morph and transition into ways in however they're needed. And that's just about going to do it for this episode here on the Sedgwick Jimmy channel. And hey, if you like what we're doing, give us a like, give us a subscribe if you want to see more. If you have ideas for how we can make things better, or even ideas for, different videos going forward, let us know in the comments. Let your friends know if they like to hear weird stuff and a strange Texan drawl. So yeah, again, I appreciate you giving us a listen. I hope y'all have a great day, and we'll see you again back here on the Cedric Jimmy channel. Stick around.